Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the City Club of Portland, Portland's own Citizens Forum. My name is Susan Hammer, and I'm president of City Club. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones and other things that beep and ring and break into song. I have a few announcements before we move to our program. This will be the last Friday Forum of the year, and happy holidays to each of you. City Club's offices will be closed between December 25th through January 1st. Our next Friday Forum will be on Friday, January 5th, and it will be the ever-popular economic forecast for 2007. We'll have three great speakers, Joe Courtwright, Jerry Johnson, and John Mitchell. So I hope to see you all there. We have someone to thank today, and that is our communications coordinator, who will be leaving City Club to go on to other adventures. And I'd like to just take a moment to thank Chris Cochran, who's in the back of the room. Could you stand up, Chris? I'm delighted to announce that we have new quarterly sponsors beginning today. As you know, our quarterly sponsors do so much to help make these programs possible, not only to those of us who are in the room today, but to thousands of people that are able to listen to City Club, watch City Club on radio and television. Our new quarterly sponsors are Girding Edlin Development Company, LLC, and McEwen Gisvold, LLP. Would you please join me in thanking them? Last week at City Club, we held an evening event, a literary event featuring 15 local authors, each of whom read their own work. Our second literary event for this month, and our final one, is today's program entitled Writing Portland, Portland Makes an Appearance. Now, those of us that call Portland home think it's actually normal to have bookstores in every neighborhood, have numerous literary events, readings, and lectures, and to have lots of book clubs. We forget that the whole world isn't necessarily like this. Portland is considered to be a literary capital, not just a great city of readers, but also a great city of writers. Today's forum will feature four of Portland's luminaries, David Biespiel, David Oates, Sallie Tisdale, and they will be interviewed by Matthew Stadler. David Biespiel, who is sitting right next to Ron Paul, is an award-winning poet. Whoops, no. Right there, yes. You can hold up your hand so they can identify you. Is an award-winning poet and the director and writer-in-residence of the Attic Writers Workshop in Portland. He edited the recently released Long Journey, Contemporary Northwest Poets, which was featured in last Sunday's Oregonian. He's also the editor of the newly resurrected Poetry Northwest magazine. David Oates, second from the end, writes both nonfiction and poetry. His most recent work, published in September, is called City Limits, Walking Portland's Boundary. It's an overview, an urban trek in search of community and connectedness. And you may recall that the New Leaders Council last spring walked the urban growth boundary with David, and his book was one of those featured in our monthly Citizens Read. David Oates also teaches aspiring writers through the Wild Writers seminars that he leads, and he teaches writing and literature at Clark College. Sallie Tisdale, at the far end, her works have varied from examining life in the Northwest with Stepping Westward, The Long Search for Home in the Pacific Northwest, to her most recent book, Women of the Way, Discovering 2,500 Years of Buddhist Wisdom. She's a contributing writer for Harper's and Salon magazines. She is a past recipient of fellowships from the NEA and the Pope Foundation, among others. Matthew Stadler will lead the discussion. He is on Ron Paul's right. He's an award-winning novelist whose works include Landscape, Memory, The Sex Offender, and Alan Stein. He is also the host of The Back Room, a discussion series that features interviews with members of the literary and arts communities. And I'd also like to point out that we have reason to congratulate Matthew today. He has been recently awarded an award through the United States Artists Fellowship Foundation, a $50,000 prize, Ford Foundation money. So congratulations, Matthew. Each of these authors' books can be found in the back of the room after today's event if you're interested. So our format today will be David, and Sallie reading excerpts of their choosing that embody Portland. Matthew will then follow, interviewing them, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So let's begin with David.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to read I just gave Matthew my watch. I'm going to read one poem, maybe two, from a book I published a few years ago. I don't write a lot of poems set in Portland. I don't write a lot of poems set anywhere. I tend to write poems that are what are known as dramatic monologues. They're poems in other voices of other people or other voices in my head. Fragments of my own personality. But I realized I did write this poem called Mount Tabor, which is near where I live. I'm going to read two about near where I live. Mount Tabor. A slanted rain on the east side of the river, below the dormant mountain. Here, in a place I never knew as a child, the old women sit with their knitting and pluck yarn as if stripping feathers off a chicken. Or other days, dog-earing their Corinthians, their Job and Solomon's songs. They sing of slaughter, decaying birds, and the silent speech that flies like a summer all over the world. Neither day nor night reverses aging gardens forgotten in the footnotes of expert treatises on time. Even lovers who walk along the emptied volcano know this is how it started. Words and love, like roses for hands or tombs. It'll never end. So now, when the children come, and without pain, picnic in the grass, the old women watch them as if in a changeless dream that, even late in life, having passed through many doors, imprisons them with faith afresh. I live on Hawthorne Boulevard, essentially. And, Hawthorne Boulevard has changed in the 10 years I've lived in Portland. And I wrote this as a response in a fashion. It's called gentrification. which I'm okay with because, I don't know, that's the way the world goes. I live on the 39th side of Hawthorne, near the mount, toward Mount Tabor, and things are still a little different up there. This poem is not so affirmative. Gentrification. Pardon me. I'm worn out with these stud desserts. They leave me dysphagic as a father. The descant is snide. Where is the antsy dynast now? The golden eagle dreaming of Elgin marble like the Golgotha loaded with grit. The shops keep coming past 39th Street. Antiques and wine bars overtaking the auto bodies and head shops. The gentle women with their flag-draped prams morph into foggy homographs. Foul-tempered, trumped with pills, cringing in fragmented muzak of cunning. They're a horde of determination, a faction of musique concrete. They snort their ounces of Ouija as if sniffing sunlight when or if it comes. And yet, is this the way we will meet, pleased to be the other's rag? Is this the way we trade our drought of kamikaze youth out of earshot of the busking violinist as his music, like the dervishes of order and odometers of Om, goes mad? Thank you.
Hi, this is David Oates. My book is called City Limits, Walking Portland's Boundary. This was a collaborative trek that I took mostly alone. It was 260 miles, sometimes kayaking, sometimes walking. I invited a few people to come walk with me from time to time, city planners, writers, developers, poets. They contributed a little bit to the book. And as I walked, I thought, why limit myself to people who are alive? So I invited a few people whose books I knew well to come walk with me. One of them was Italo Calvino, who died in 1984, an Italian novelist and fabulist, a man of immense imagination and a tremendous commitment to civic life. So I included the chapter that I ghost wrote with him, the walk that we took together. And here's a little passage from that. Italo said, "The UGB, the urban growth boundary, is your frame tale, wanderer. Within it, 1,000 other tales are told, 1,000 other Portlands are built. The tasteful towers and plazas of the Pearl District, where your journey does not go, but which it implies, the center you are circling, those are Portland's idyllic dream, a utopia oiled, as these things always are, by money, as certainly as Florence was, afloat on de Medici money, Vatican money, creating a shining Camelot of civic humanism, despite the viciousness of city politics and papal intrigues, blood feuds and murders and plagues and religious police of the Inquisition, answered in outbreaks of fundamentalists. I said, there's always a Savonarola waiting in the wings. Or worse, he replied. Cities, like dreams, are made of desires and fears. The thread of their discourse is secret, their rules are absurd, their perspectives are deceitful, and everything conceals something else. What is Portland concealing? We had come to another rise as we walked. A moment of sunshine illuminated Markham Hill with its hospitals and research towers. I said, Portland seems to want to hold its head up, to be first among cities, yet at the same time, it craves anonymity. We put up a statue called Portlandia, 10 times life-size, but then we hid it behind trees. Even standing across the street from it, it's always playing peekaboo. And when we started arranging that aerial tram to go up to the medical school, the official talk was all about creating a postcard, a unique and memorable icon. It would be our Eiffel Tower. But when the design decision came, it chose none of the bold or striking plans. No, it chose a design that seemed to be disappearing. A tram with invisibly slender towers, gondolas to blend with the clouds, and in the first design phase, a lower terminus hidden beneath a mat of grass. Italo smiled. "It's your invisible postcard," he said. "Perhaps there is no deeper fear of discovery after all," he said, "for then all your illusions are put to the test, to the harsh light of day." I said, "But it makes me dizzy sometimes, Portland's simultaneous pursuit of excellence and mediocrity." Italo seemed to know what I was talking about. He said, "The more enlightened our houses are, the more their walls ooze ghosts. Dreams of progress and reason are haunted by nightmares. That's why your utopia begins to resemble a labyrinth as you walk it. It's full of dead ends, tangles of good intention and self-defeat. And most of all, it is full of the unspoken, that which you remain silent about. That's what stories are for, to speak the unspeakable, to find the myth, the hidden part of every story, the region that is still unexplored because there are, as yet, no words to get us there." Thank you.
Hello. I'm going to read from a book called Portland from the Air. It was a very interesting assignment. It's a book of aerial photographs of Portland, and part of the book are historical photographs side by side with contemporary photographs, so you can see what Westmoreland neighborhood looked like 40 years ago and what it looks like now. And I noticed when I started and I saw the photos that I was working with that there wasn't a single one that had rain in it. Every single photo in this whole book is a sunny day. So I was working with some limited material to start with. I found my assignment was to write the character of Portland, and I found that a theme that I returned to again and again and really became the major theme is Portland's argument with itself, as long as it's existed, about whether it's a big city or not. And wanting to be a big city, but not wanting to give up the small town parts. And our history is just riddled with some very funny and some very strange anecdotes around that. But then there's what happens as we try to become a city. Portland was born protected in that clearing between the Willamette and the hills, and it remains protected. This is not a tough city. We're safe from scouring Midwestern winds most of the time, and deep frozen winters. We don't face ocean storms or huddle in prairie emptiness. More than anything, Portland's character is marked by this soft embrace of green hills, by the steady movement of the rivers which run strong and deep. The shelter that Portlanders have always cherished has made the city what it is today, tender, a bit thin-skinned. There is longing in Portland's heart, the dilemma of big-time dreams and small-town virtues, a twin yearning for bright city lights and dark country skies. This tension seems eternal. Civic leaders and supporters were never content with the natural gifts and great good luck of Portland's surrounding. They wanted respect and notice, preferably from rollicking places like San Francisco and bustling, sophisticated cities like New York, places far away and as different from Portland as cities could be. I try to imagine the old waterfront. I try to imagine no public dock, no east side view of the downtown streets, no grass, no flocks of sailboats. I try to imagine the crowded, rickety double wharves hidden behind masted ships. I think of the long, empty seawall and office buildings that followed the wharves. I think of the 6-lane Harbor Drive highway, too dangerous to cross. I try to remember, I think we all should remember, that River City didn't claim its river for more than 125 years. In 1938, Lewis Mumford asked the City Club, "Are you good enough to have this country in your possession?" It was an appropriate question to ask in a city of declining neighborhoods and growing sprawl, and for a major part of the century, the answer has seemed to be no. In the growth of the last few decades, hills, meadows, and commanding vistas have been swallowed by developments and office buildings. Spacious grasslands are covered in houses. A giant's bouquet of fir and hemlock has been cut down. Sometimes I drive through streets of bad dreams, scattered all along the city's edges. I follow narrow, winding roads designed long ago for sparse rural traffic, and I pass through unending urban congestion, along narrow sidewalks pressed between townhouses and sprawling apartment complexes. I wander oddly graded new streets dug out of the slopes of eroding hills, between inflated mini-mansions separated by wide, empty lawns. I drive because there is no choice, from one silent group of houses to the next, trying to find a grocery store, a bank, anything to make this more than sprawl, to make it that magic ingredient of cities, a neighborhood. And yet, I stand on the bluff, fortuitously named Overlook, and trace the impenetrable dark reach of Forest Park. I count the thick-trunked conifers that still shadow the precarious manses of the West Hills. I gaze down on the ships below, so comfortable in their wide, wet berths. I look up the river and see the sandy reaches, the wetlands and islands, the flocks of migratory birds. I can hardly imagine the sweep of the original 640-acre claims, what wealth they contained, what glorious luck they held. Stumptown, a muddy, mean town, smelling of the tannery and horse manure, its sticky streets a hazardous maze of stumps, slowly picked its way up and out and spread into the hills and along the flooding banks. But that slow sprawl left oases, deliberate and accidental, and we still have breathing room between the towers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sallie, David, and David. David Oates brought a question which I think is a great place to start. What is Portland concealing? And I wonder if each of you could tell us a little bit about what you see it concealing, and tell me if you agree with David's hunch that it is through story and through the act of writing that this labyrinth unfolds and that what is concealed becomes articulate.
This is David Oates. Portland's a wonderful place to live. I've lived here 15 years. I grew up in Los Angeles. I know the difference. But that money that builds our downtown, that development that erases the past, that tendency to pour more and more money into the downtown development and ignore what happens out east of 82nd, north of Alberta, that amnesia that afflicts us so that whatever was in the Pearl District before has vanished. We have shiny new condos and nice places to eat if you got enough money, and it seems like that amnesia, that failure to remember working folks, families with kids, I think that's part of what Portland conceals, a kind of boosterism that I'm sometimes afflicted with myself because I love it here so much. Portland won't come into its greatness until it recognizes its own darkness and brings it out into the public, copes with it, remembers it, moves forward.
Too short for this game. I would speak to the word story that you used, and that David used. I love that this is a city that cherishes books and writers and words, but everybody has a story. Everybody tells this story, and Portland's story is about all the people. So there are certain voices that are louder than others and that articulate parts of that story. But everybody in this room and everybody in this city has a story to tell that's different from everybody else's. And there's something that each of us can do that nobody else can do for this city, for ourselves as citizens of this city. And part of that story to me is get out there and tell it, say it. You know, we do a lot of crosstalk and a lot of criticism and boosterism among our friends and in our small groups, but I think there's a very large civic dialogue that could take place that would be much bigger than this room.
Yeah, I don't know that I can tackle that so well. I resist a little the feelings of nationalism with literature, local nationalism, localism, provincialism with literature. I think one thing Portland conceals is something that's there, at least in the time I've lived here, is its ambition. That Portland can easily become a center of literary culture, not just for Portlanders, but for beyond Portland. The writers are here, the imaginations are here, but an infrastructure for creating, inventing, projecting, and most importantly, publishing and distributing literature beyond the urban growth boundary, I think is what starts to define a city as a major literary city.
It's interesting, all three of you have kind of opened up the several different cans containing some worms. I did want to pick up on David Oates' mention of the hidden stories. It made me think about Vanport, and just what an incredible set of changes in the city accumulated in the construction of Vanport and then in its demise. And as far as a drama that could become a story, what an amazing part of the city's history, which has been written but not yet definitively written. You say, David Biespiel, that you're suspicious of a kind of localism which can become provincialism. It was interesting, while we heard the readings, we heard of talk of Golgotha, talk of Florence, images of San Francisco, of New York, that in the course of making descriptions of Portland, we were rarely restricted to being in Portland. I'm wondering, and David Biespiel, as you read, particularly the intonation you gave to your first poem, it reminded me of a characterization you made of your own work of being, call me Northwest writing, Texas style. Do you think that there is, in writing, even if you're starting from this intense sense of place, an intense connection to a landscape, such as David Oates activated in this Walking the Boundary, such as in Sallie's work that we heard, and also in Stepping Westward, is that a place that you then move away from terrain and into something placeless? Is writing a way away from the specificity of where you are, or is it a way kind of more deeply into the particulars of this, the language and the hidden parts of the terrain that gave rise to the moment of writing? Does that question make sense? And you see writing moving you in one direction or the other?
I can only speak for poetry, though not for all poets. I think that there are two ways of handling one's writing. Mm-hmm. You begin with experience and work your way into language. You begin with memory, something you've culled from the past, something that occurred to you on the way over to lunch, and then try to find the language that will suffice to make something that lasts beyond that experience. Other writers will begin with language. I would take it to put it in a different art medium. contrast the kind of paintings, say, between Norman Rockwell on the one hand, who begins with experience and characterizes it, and, say, Jackson Pollock on the other hand, who's famous for saying that when asked if there's where the nature is in his painting, he said, "I'm the nature." Mm-hmm. And so those two ways, I think, take you into and beyond issues of place in particular, especially if you begin with language first.
I would say that no matter whether you're directly addressing the place you're in or not, you're always a writer of your place, and you cannot escape what made you yourself. And to that extent, David is always a Los Angeles writer in some way. And think of the immense literature that came out of New York City. It's okay, David. There are great writers coming out of Los Angeles. And I am forever a writer who was born and raised in a little tiny logging town in the Siskiyou Mountains, where books were not that valued and story was not told in the same way it is here. And that propelled me toward a city, but it also kept me in the Northwest. And no matter what I'm writing about, and I have written about Italy and Japan, but I'm always a writer from that place, whether I'm addressing it or not. I could never be a New York writer. Does that make some sense?
It does, absolutely. That in fact, this origin that you carry with you in your body and the way you assemble and make language out of what you're thinking, but then Robert Frost is forever a San Francisco writer, too. He's from San Francisco. And as David Biespiel points out in Long Journey, William Stafford is forever a Kansas poet. And it's interesting that we can gain such great insight into the specificity of Oregon through a man who carries Kansas in him. Do you think this is just a happy match? Or is it what it means to be a good writer, that you can take whatever that origin is and bring it to bear on a new place?
I think, William Stafford's view is William Stafford as a Kansan who came here. Mm-hmm. If it was William Stafford had been born here, he would have been a different writer. I mean, I don't think you can escape your conditions that way. But it's very hard to define what it is that makes William Stafford William Stafford. So maybe David could speak to that.
I don't know that I can do that, but I could try. I think that for me, the problem with defining someone by where I don't disagree with you. I understand that I'm still a Texan as well as the next person. The difficulty of thinking of someone as, say, a Portland writer, or, if you want to push it, a Multnomah County writer. Stafford would be a Lake Oswego writer, is it gets ridiculous. Because there are, as a reader, just speaking as a reader, there are better ways of describing someone's writing rather than from their place. If I think of William Stafford, I think it would be more helpful to me as a reader to consider him a philosophical poet rather than a Portland poet. It tells me more about his methods. It tells me more about his products and his imagination than to describe him as a Portland poet when I know that there are dozens and dozens of others that don't write anything like William Stafford, and they would also be Portland poets. It makes me question what kind of value the word Portland has as an aesthetic.
It does make you question, it's almost as though the word Portland is gaining shape and capacities by who decides to make it their subject, not that it is framing them and limiting them. It reminds me of something David Oates, or maybe it was Calvino, said. I think the line was that the UGB, the urban growth boundary, which we can think of as a very elegant device for saying this is the place. It's an actual set of lines, but you do a superb job in the book of pointing out that it's the fluctuation and movement, the changing relation we have to this UGB that's in fact of note. It's not what it defines, but what it's doing. And you have Calvino say that it's our framing tale. I want you to sort of expand on what does that mean, and is that a sense in which place, I guess, does not define or dictate how you write and what you will write, but nevertheless gives it coherence or gives it gives you a way to write?
I think every writer looks for that slant that unlocks the fountain of imagination and language. And I think it's different for every writer. Emily Dickinson says, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. And each of us has a certain way of holding our head, metaphorically, that somehow gets us in the right frame of mind. And it might be writing in someone else's voice, or it might be standing at a certain distance from your own personal drama, or a certain closeness to it. And that can change over your life as a writer. But I think each writer has a unique stance in the world in relationship both to place and to events in his or her own life and to events in the larger world around. For me, geography is an immensely imaginatively unlocking experience. And so for me to sort of ground myself and to plant my feet on the ground and walk it and feel it and be out in the rain in it, it unlocks my imagination. I don't think there's anything intrinsic about that. It's just the way my head works. I'm very attracted to the work of John Muir, the turn of the last century environmentalist, because he had kind of the same relationship with land, and more so much so that he became a seat-of-the-pants geologist. But it was about so much more than geology for him that sometimes I think of calling him a geologian, because it's half theology and half geology, and I feel a kinship with him.
Yeah.
Place, what is the difference between place and topography? I think place arises when you have stories to tell, when there's been some human living forth and living through in a spot that gets connected to that spot. That's what makes it place and not just dirt.
Given that, and the fact, and I think we can agree that the road toward creating the coherent narrative, the story that creates place, that turns terrain or information into something which you actually have a deep feeling about, given that writing could emerge from walking the land, from Washington Irving sitting holed up in John Jacob Astor's study in the Hudson Valley and writing the whole history of the Astoria expedition. Our regional literature, I think we can agree, could come from almost anywhere. I wonder if each of you would contribute what you think has been for you a superb example of a literary place, a piece of writing in which you find this city.
1,000 Little Hitlers, Eleanor Langer. She deals with our darkness, she deals with our place.
Say her name again, please.
Eleanor Langer, and the book is 1,000 Little Hitlers, and it concerns street punks and the Nazi movement in the 80s.
For me, and this is partly because I grew up in a little logging town where there were 7 mills, 3,000 people in 7 mills. Stuart Holbrook is always my voice of the old Northwest. He really identified with and connected with the working people, not just the loggers, but all the working people whose voice is not heard very often. And so I've always gone to him as the voice of who we were and how, and old Portland, which is still here underneath. And some of what we've been talking about today is what's buried under the new urban sophistication of Portland, and it's Stuart Holbrook's world. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
I think I can only, in terms of poetry, that those classics haven't been made yet. There are certainly poets whose work is outstanding. Stafford is one, and he would be the granddaddy of them all. But there's a whole generation of younger poets in the city today making work that is in a different tradition. I will resist naming them because I know I'll leave people out, but the new poetry of the city is very, very exciting and worth one's time.
Where should we look for it?
Any independent bookstore. Most independent bookstores in the city have actually great poetry sections. So I would lead you there. I just resisting saying people's names.
There's also a collection just about ready to appear of Portland writers, not necessarily poets. It's called Reading Portland. It's from University of Washington Press in partnership with Oates, and it's edited by John Trombold and Peter Donahue. Reading Portland.
very good recommendation. I think, and John and Peter had done a volume called Reading Seattle. It will be interesting to compare that book to Reading Portland in that the histories of the cities may be of similar duration, and yet the task that John and Peter faced when trying to deal with the avalanche of writing about Portland that extends back to one of the earliest weekly news magazines, Western Shore, was quite stunning and different than what they faced with Seattle. Portland is a city that has written itself quite thoroughly since the beginning.
More than Seattle.
I think so, and well, maybe a future City Club panel should be with John and Peter, but the research that's gone into it has been very interesting. Ultimately, what we come to then is writing. Whether we begin walking the boundary, whether we begin with memories of plucking chickens and reading from the classics and arriving in a caldera, and I was going to say, there's one thing I really love about Sallie's work is how thoroughly, whatever the origin, whatever the richness of place, you enter into such a beautiful space of writing that wherever we're going, it's about writing. And I guess my closing comment before we then open to questions from the floor was to just say that it's important to write well, and it's important what we choose to imagine. These are opportunities to imagine our way toward cities that may not exist in the data banks of fact and information. They may not exist on the news. They may not exist in planning discussions. But the great gift that imaginative writers can bring is we're being given the commission to imagine this city. And with that in mind, my suggestion is a great classic, The Lathe of Heaven, in which Portland, in about our time, is a city of many million people with a subway system extending to Vancouver under a constant cloud of rain, and really amazing place that Ursula K. Le Guin was able to imagine in 1971, because working from this place, she brought to bear the incredible richness of her imagination to ask, what is this place in our minds and in the future? We've gotten a little way into a big subject, and I think Ron Paul is going to get us sort of kicked off on asking more questions, but please contribute by stepping up to the mic and becoming one of an element of today's discussion about writing Portland. So, Ron?
Our first question today will be asked by board host Ron Paul. Ron is a member of the City Club Board of Governors. He's chair of the City Club's Agri Committee, and he also serves as vice chair of the Oregon Arts Commission. Ron is a consultant for business, government, and nonprofit sector as a civic entrepreneur. Ron.
From this podium in recent memory, we've talked about the politics and benefits of eating local. What are the similarities in reading local?
There's some things you never get. Quite seriously, if we eat locally, I'm never going to get another mango, and that's a hard thing for me to give up. And there's writers I will never read, and there's points of view I'll never see. So there's validity to it, but you have to know what the limitations are.
It only happens if there's an infrastructure to enable it to happen. We need periodicals, which are places for pungent, sharp, local, insistent voices. We need a first-class university. We have parts of a first-class university here. We need publishers who are supported, funded, whose books are bought.
Yeah, I think that there's the difference between inventors and curators. If the Oregon Symphony only played Oregon music, well, if they only played organ music, that would be Papa. That would be one kind of symphony. If the museum only presented local Oregon painters, it'd be one thing. I edited a magazine, Poetry Northwest. If we only did Northwest poets and writers, that would be there'd be no mangoes, I think. But the curatorial aim, I think, is important, of creating a venue like the symphony that provides Mozart and Bach and so forth, or a Poetry Northwest that provides an Yves Bonfoy and a Robert Bly, and alongside local writers at the same time.
You know, I'm going to now pose as a writer too, because it's an excellent question, and Sally's answer reminded me of a question. I'm often on panels where I'm asked, what is gay writing? And I'm never comfortable with that question until I finally came up with the answer I believe in, which is, it's gay writing if I'm reading it. And in this case, I think part of what's essential about reading is that it is the act of reading which brings meaning, brings the text to life. And if we read locally, I think, as Ron suggests, that simply means let's read as Portlanders. Let's read as people who live here and who bring exactly what Sallie was saying about her childhood, their sensibilities and their being to bear on the work. And in that way, we can read Proust, and we can read Catullus, we can read those as Portlanders and thereby read locally.
Thank you. Time now for questions from the audience. In this context, question is 30 seconds or less. And the reason we ask that, of course, is so that more people will have a chance to participate. It's a question, not a speech. Ends with a question mark. And if you like, please direct it to one of the people or more if you prefer.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. From what I can tell, there's a lot of aspiring, whatever the word is, writers here in the audience. How do you suggest people become published that would like to write? And also, at what point, when you know you're going to embarrass your relatives, how do you switch to a pen name?
Take that one.
I'll start out. I was the editor of a book section at a periodical called The Stranger, and a man calling himself Terminator started sending me work. It was very good work, and I published it. And about halfway through the year that I was working with him, he told me, I need to now use my real name. It's J.T. Leroy. And then I started to publish work by J.T. Leroy and helped to coach him through the trauma of owning up to his own work. J.T. Leroy has recently turned out to be a woman in her mid-40s who wanted her work to get out there and wasn't having luck with it, and had used this both pseudonym and false life, the life of a runaway, to get her work out there. I think you can go that direction, starting with a pseudonym and eventually exposing who you really are, but I don't think you can go the other way. I would say what Sallie and David had mentioned is in fact happening in Portland. There are, Poetry Northwest is now based here, thanks to David Biespiel. There are several remarkably good independent publishers, including Hawthorne Books, Verse Chorus Press. I edit a press called Clear Cut Press. These are people in your community looking for good writing. And I guess the best way, as with any publisher, is simply read what you like, find out who's making it, who's making books that are like what you think is valuable in literature, and then send them your work. And be prepared for 1,000 misunderstandings. But Portland is remarkably rich in those opportunities right now, I think.
Practical advice, write short. Find magazines that you like. Figure out what they're printing. Write short, send to them.
Dina Marshall, City Club member, fairly recent. My question is about how do you imagine yourselves? David Biespiel, with regards to gentrification, you said, I kind of like it, and you resist a local nationalism. David Oates, you invited influential persons to walk with you around this urban growth boundary around the city, and talked about a simultaneous pursuit of excellence and mediocrity. And Sallie Oates, you talked about Portland's argument with itself regarding to be a big city or not. And I wonder if you imagine yourselves as simply storytellers of Portland, or also if you see yourselves as effecting some sort of change politically or within the community.
Well, both, of course. I write because I have to write, because that's how my words are the way I explain the world to myself, and and I can't shut up. So you get to hear it too. But of course, anybody who loves their place and their world wants to affect a change and make things better. And books, I love it when I hear censors of various stripes say, well, books are dangerous, because it's like, damn right they are. They better be dangerous. That's what they're for. So I would love to be effective, to move people. And the most wonderful thing readers have ever said to me is, you said what I felt and I couldn't find the words. You articulated it for me, because that's the most wonderful thing for me as a writer, to hear that there was a meeting of minds, and that changes us. So, but if nobody read, I'd still write. So the answer is both.
Language and all the arts are about connecting. Mozart said, I don't write for the drawer, I write for other people. The language that connects us partly is literature. Calvino says, everything that is useful to the whole business of living together in a civilized way is energy well spent. And in that sense, as a writer, I am a booster for civilization, for connectedness, and therefore for the great project of making Portland into a better place to live, even better than it is now.
I would agree with both of those things, and I would add too that for me, when I first started writing, I wanted to write things that made people cry. And now I find myself more wanting to communicate with the poets of the past. I accept that burden. It's an exciting burden to try to write something that, in my own imagination, Shakespeare would find of interest as a starting point. For poetry, the readers come to poetry. It's a different relationship, and the experience of reading poetry is subversive. It's not like going to the movies. It's a one-on-one thing. It's you and the poem, and nothing else can exist in that moment. It's a slowing down, and so to get inside of a reader into that intimate way is best not talked about.
Paddy Tillett, City Club member. Question for David Oates that I suspect he's thought about before, and that is, what would Calvino report to the Great Khan through the intermediary of Marco Polo about Portland? And the second question is for David Biespiel, and that is, what would the old ladies of Mount Tabor with their knitting make of South Waterfront if you were to take them down there?
The question refers to Italo Calvino's probably best-known book, which is called Invisible Cities, in which Marco Polo tells tales to the Great Khan about cities which do not yet exist, which may exist, which he imagines exist. It's sort of a 1,001 tales, but of really fantastic Escher-like urban fantasies. What would he say about Portland? It's a city that sort of shimmers in the rain, that sometimes it's there as a shining Camelot of possibility and connectedness and civic achievement, and sometimes it's just a mudflat.
Was that a question, really?
Mount Tabor.
Mount Tabor?
The knitting ladies, how would they respond to South Waterfront?
Yeah.
Oh, they don't go down there.
You'd have to take them there.
If I were to take them there, I'm afraid of them.
Justin Gottlieb, City Club member. My question deals with the infrastructure of the creativity. How do you engage the business and the political community here to produce books, to create the infrastructure of publishing, distribution networks, to make Portland a hub like New York or San Francisco? I guess that's my question, aside from just the writing creativity, is how do you build that business infrastructure, and what can we do to contribute?
My answer is mostly I don't know. I keep wondering. But I do know one way, which is that we have one excellent university press in the state of Oregon. It's University of Oregon Press. OSU, thank you. Oregon State University Press. Yes, it is. They deserve support. They deserve public support from our politicians and from our tax base. They're struggling. We just lost a press at Oregon Historical Society. That's a wound. We need to think about that.
I think the same intensity, energy, and capital that's put into building buildings in the city can be put into building a literary infrastructure. It takes a kind of leadership and a certain sort of value that when you're creating, that's the first call, or that's the first donation. Establishing a base for culture, I think, defines a city as much as anything else. We can't be a city without a growing and dynamic and provocative culture. And as a city of readers, which we are proud of, we need it to be a city of publishers as well.
In your discussions, can you hear me? In your discussions, I didn't hear any reference to writers who've written wonderful Portland books such as Kim McCall, Jewel Lansing, Carl Abbott. Where do people who've written that kind of book fit into what you're telling us?
I know I've been very indebted to Carl Abbott's work, for sure. And there are a number of other, what you would have to classify as local writers. That has been their main or only theme, has been Portland, the Northwest, Oregon, history, and so on. Incredibly valuable. And when I've written about other places, I've been equally dependent on the local writers from those places as well. It's a foundation that just, you know, a lot of the kind of work that's written about the Northwest couldn't exist without this foundation of local view, local perspective, local historical collection. And so-called amateur historians are incredibly valuable to professional historians. Please save your letters. Please save your photographs. Please write the names of the people that are in the photographs on the back of the photographs. Digital world is going to destroy the history of the future. So it's so important. I'll just start repeating myself. And everyone in here is an amateur historian of Portland and very valuable in that way.
Wonderful nonfiction works that you've mentioned. Add to that list Martha Gee's nonfiction essays, Up All Night. Wonderful read.
And I was going to speak up for Eugene Snyder, who does just remarkable, detailed histories of early Portland. I was also interjecting to say to the last question, we need an aggressively intelligent, challenging book review periodical from here. We have great books being published, we have great writers, we have a big community of readers. We need a very visible, well-made Portland review of books, and that's the missing piece.
The newspaper has really dropped a lot of book coverage, an awful lot of writing coverage. The coverage of the Oregon Book Awards is, I'm sorry, it's pathetic. We need much better media around it. I want to add the name of Frances Fuller Victor, too. If you want to read a local writer, turn of the century, the Margaret Dumont of Oregon history, she is indomitable. So,
Carly Kelly, City Club member. My question is about the younger generation of readers, probably because I have a teenage son at home who, when I say, why don't you read, tells me I read constantly and I write constantly. But what he's not talking about books. He's talking about all of the time that he spends on the internet, where he is reading constantly and writing constantly, but there is, to my mind, there's no filter in what he's getting. How do you as writers relate or think about relating to this upcoming generation? Is it just a different medium, or is it a true change in consciousness?
We could be seeing the end of the book. I mean, I think it's that dire. I have a teenage son, and he plays on the internet a lot. He does read a lot. He reads other things as well. He also plays music. He does a lot of things. I can think of my own childhood, the thrill I had of biking over to the local library and being allowed to roam the stacks all by myself for the first time. I suppose the internet is that kind of thrill. I'd love to redo my reading as a child. I just want to do over, knowing what I know now. But I wouldn't give up the things I did read. I loved reading every single Agatha Christie mystery. I don't write mysteries. I don't have much interest in them anymore. But they must have fed me in some way that mattered, that you don't know about till you get older and engage literature in a different fashion. Kids also are reading song lyrics. They're really engaged with the language of music. And any engagement with any art, I think, is going to transfer to the other arts as they get older.
No, I don't believe we're seeing the end of the book because it's a perfect tool. I mean, how can you fix it? It's already a perfect object. But we are seeing a significant decline in cultural literacy, and certainly people's ability to edit and to read carefully is not being nurtured. And only the schools are really going to make a difference there. How children learn to read and write day by day by day is going to make a difference there. So it's an open question where it's going.
I wanted to add to the voice of optimism. I think I have a 7-year-old child, and I've never seen a group of a generation so focused on reading because of the internet. They have to read and write. I think that it looks strange and chaotic and incoherent because the logic of how we shape stories and how we shape the writing is shifting. But that's something which has happened before, that the book has survived and that writing has survived. And it's a very exciting time to try and both be a writer who enacts our own old stories and coherences, and yet try to understand and learn from a whole new set of text-based, language-obsessed kids whose lives are saturated with the written word.
I'm sorry to say our time is up. On behalf of the City Club of Portland, I'd like to thank our members and guests for your participation here today, to our radio and television audience for your interest in City Club, and I'd like you to all join me in thanking David Biespiel, David Oates, Sallie Tisdale, and Matthew Stadler for a very interesting and thoughtful presentation. We are adjourned. See you next year.